drugs is a broad subject. It encompasses what we currently see as illegal drugs, some of which have medicinal uses, some of which don't, but also things like tobacco and alcohol, which for historic reasons have never been made illegal. But of course, drugs are used because people enjoy using them. Some people then become dependent on them and then they can't stop using them. That becomes a habit, or what we call an addiction. And some drugs are used medicinally. And that presents a real challenge to governments and to regulators and to doctors as to how best to balance the benefits of the drugs against the harms of the drugs. And no one has come up with a perfect way of regulating drugs. What we do in the UK at present is this, we divide drugs into two sorts. Medicines, and they're controlled under the Medicines Act, and so-called illegal drugs, which are controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Acts. And one of the problems in the UK is that many drugs fall into both acts. In fact, most drugs which are abused or can be abused, like benzodiazepines, like heroin, like ketamine, they're both medicines under the Medicines Act, and they're illegal drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act. So that's one major issue. The other thing is that within the Misuse of Drugs Act, there are subclassifications, and these three classes, A, B, and C, they're designed to determine the harmfulness of drugs. So drugs are supposed to be in different classes according to their real harm. So as you might imagine, drugs like heroin and crack cocaine are in class A, and the benzodiazepines are in class C. Unfortunately, over the last 20 years or so, the Misuse of Drugs Act has become used much more as an agent of political argument rather than as a truly evidence-based scientific, with an evidence-based scientific process. So now we see things like drugs such as psilocybin, magic mushrooms, which were not controlled until about 2005, and now are in class A alongside crack cocaine. And those sorts of decisions were made by politicians rather than by scientists. And so that has rather undermined the value of the Misuse of Drugs Act, because when you start to use it to educate children about the relative harms of drugs, they immediately see anomalies such as the high classification of magic mushrooms. They see cannabis being class B, and they say, well, why should they be there when they're not as harmful as the other drugs that are there? So the educational message, the educational value of the Misuse of Drugs Act becomes a bit tenuous. But worse than that, of course, that then allows the inappropriate penalisation of people who use those drugs. So people get harsher penalties. And a very good example of that is ecstasy, MDMA. Now, MDMA has been in Class A ever since it was made illegal. The evidence that it's as harmful as Class A drugs like heroin and cocaine is very limited, and most people think it should be at the most Class B. But it hasn't been moved down in class because the government has been terrified of supposed public opinion. It's also, wanted to appear strong on drugs. So now people who are convicted of ecstasy offences, they run the risk of getting the same kind of penalties as those who are convicted of heroin or crack. And in fact, we know that often they get more severe penalties because judges tend to view ecstasy use as non-addictive. So they're sympathetic to people who are addicted to crack and heroin, but they're not sympathetic to people who use ecstasy. So they often get longer prison sentences for possession than you might expect from the relative harmfulness of the drug. So there's injustice which comes from the regulations not being scientifically accurate, and there's also a failure to communicate the true relative harms of drugs. And over the years, I've tried hard to rectify this by developing a much more rational way of looking at drug harms. Because, in truth, the original classification in the Misuse of Drugs Act was done simply by a group of people around a table just telling what they thought, without any systematic analysis of what the relative harms might be. And I worked for the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs for about 10 years, and a lot of what I did during that time was try to develop a very much more systematic, transparent way of assessing drug harms. And I did it in two phases. Initially, I developed a 9-point scale of harm, and then when that was published, with the feedback from that, I started developing, with the Home Office's help as well, what we would consider the definitive 16-point scale of harms. And that looks at the harms of all drugs, from what the drug might do to you, how likely you are to die if you take one dose, right across the spectrum into social harms, what drug use does to societies, to communities, and even to overseas countries. So it really looks broadly across all the harms. And it turns out that there are about 9 harms which relate to an individual, and there are 7 harms which relate to society and other countries. For many of those harms, we have data. For some of those harms, we don't have data. So what we then did was use this very sophisticated technique called multi-criteria decision-making, where we got expert panels to give us the best estimate of harms. And then we aggregated all those data sets, all those 16 data sets, and we produced the definitive ranking of drug harms. And to our surprise, and I think to a lot of people's surprise, alcohol came out on top. And the reason alcohol came out on top was because alcohol to society at present is the most harmful drug. And that's for 2 reasons. One is alcohol is intrinsically quite a harmful drug. You see Amy Winehouse died of alcohol poisoning when she relapsed to drinking. But also alcohol is so widely used, and it's used by young people as well as old people, and it contributes to violence, it contributes to rape, it contributes to road traffic accidents, and it massively contributes to death. So for instance, now in the UK, alcohol is the most common reason for death in men under 50. It's more responsible for more deaths than road traffic accidents, suicide. So those kind of factors explain why, when it's used in the wide way it is used in the UK, alcohol is the most harmful drug. If you just look at the individual, then crack cocaine, heroin, crystal meth, they're more harmful to an individual user than alcohol. But because they're not so widely used in society, the actual cost in the UK is less, or the harms in the UK are less. So we use that data to argue 2 things. We used it to argue, firstly, that if we really want to focus our attempts to reduce harm sensibly, we should really look at alcohol. That should be the priority. And the second point was to say, well, why should alcohol not be controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Act? Why is it exempt when it's so harmful? And of course, the latter question is a very political question. And there's huge resistance from the drinks industry to bring alcohol under control because they make a lot of money out of it. And there's also the Treasury, they feel, well, we're getting tax benefits. And even though those tax benefits don't pay for the true costs of alcohol, the tax, they are immediate and they occur every year. Whereas if you were to bring in policies to reduce alcohol, the health benefits would come a bit later. So there are complex political arguments why it's not brought under control. But it's such a huge anomaly that I've been arguing for a long time. We really should be doing something to try to at least establish in the public's understanding that it is a really very dangerous drug. And one of the most remarkable things is that we know that over the last 15 years, it's been very stable. About half of young people, 15 to 16-year-olds, are drunk once a month. So they're using a drug illegally. Half the population is using a drug illegally once a month to a point of intoxication. Intoxication is dangerous. People die under intoxication. And the government has actually turned a blind eye to that. And one of my continual arguments with the government over the ignoring the harms of alcohol is the fact that government policy, which is targeted at stamping out the use of drugs like ecstasy and cannabis, may actually be driving people to use alcohol. It might actually be fueling the damage that alcohol does. So I think we have to, when we're looking at reducing drug harms in the whole, we have to bring all drugs into some kind of regulatory system.